Hey guys, it is Finch from FDS Drum Services, and today we are going to talk about snare beds. So today I was in the shop and I was just thinking about information, even as a drummer for myself, of what I commonly overlook, and I really don't ever hear anybody talking about this, and that is snare beds. What they are, the purpose of them, how they affect the sound of the drum, even what the bottom drum head does when you tighten it down. So stay tuned with me here and we're going to cover all kinds of cool information that might help you on your snare drum journey. Snare beds are often a very ignored part of the drum because all we care about is whether or not the drum sounds good or not. The nature of your snare beds and the choices in wires that it forces you to make are very, very important. Snare beds have changed and developed over time, so let's talk about what they are and what they mean for the snare. So say this is an uncut snare drum shell. You've got no snare beds cut into this thing. What ends up happening is your wires or your snare straps end up going over and around your shell like this, which creates two things. It creates a pinch point here on each corner, and what that does is you pull down, it ends up making your snare wires go up or create an arch. As an example, like this. It ends up arching your snare like this. So your snare beds will make a little more sense on this side. So if your snare wires are arching, the best way to make the drum head accommodate that arch is to cut in snare beds on one side and snare bed on the other side. Now what that does is if you put your hoop on top of your drum head and you tighten it all the way down, you will actually get a visual of that convex plane, and you'll actually see your snare wires snugging the curve of that drum head. Snare beds come in all shapes and sizes. You've got some that are very short, you've got some that are very deep, you've got some that are very long and shallow, and each one of these affects the drum completely because your snare bed tells you exactly what type of wires your snare drum can accept. Wider snare beds will allow you to actually take up to 42 strand wires all the way down to 16 strand. I want to give you an example of exactly what I'm talking about when we say wider snare beds can accommodate various types of snare wires. So you can see here on this Gretsch snare, our snare bed is wide and shallow. Now I put these snare wires here to show you that these are 24 strand and they only take up this amount of space, but our snare bed is cut all the way over here. So if you did have a nice fat 42 strand wire, there's still more than enough room on this snare bed to accommodate those thicker wires. So we've got the same exact thing just on this vintage Slingerland. So let's check this out. You can see our snare wires here, same 24 strand, but if you look closely, you can see that our short, narrow snare bed can only accommodate up to 24 strands because it stops here and is not cut wide. So some things to be aware of is that if your snare bed can only accommodate shorter wire, 16 strand, 20 strand, 24 strand, like this vintage Slingerland does, if you try to go any bigger than that, it's actually going to cause you a lot of sound issues. Unless, of course, you're going for something that sounds like that, you're looking for a little different sound, by all means experiment, but traditionally your snare beds will indicate exactly what your snare needs and how big it can go. In short, when you have short snare beds, you can only accept shorter wires or less wires, 16, 20, 24 strand, but if you go to a wider snare bed or a shallow snare bed, then you can go all the way up to 42 strands. So the rule of thumb is the wider your snare bed, the larger the snare wires your snare will accept.